Hi, welcome to another episode of The Postscript, a weekly podcast and YouTube series from LFBI, Living Faith Bible Institute, a international Bible school that's available streaming online. If you've got questions about it, we'd love to answer them, lfbi.org. But we're in the middle of a conversation with Eric Phillips, the Director of Worship at Midtown Baptist Temple. And we're having a conversation about ministry philosophy and about a worship philosophy and having a worship-driven ministry. In the last episode, we had a lot of conversation about principles that should guide every praise and worship team in any church, and we talked about those things. This week, we're going to have a conversation a little bit more about building a team, how the personalities of members on your team should impact the style of worship, and what kind of relationship style of praise has to any given praise team. And so, Eric Phillips, welcome back.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So with that said, I already kind of gave you the lead on that. Mm-hmm. When we're talking about praise and worship, so much of that has to do with the abilities of the people that are on your team. And so a lot of that is dictated to you. Am I right? So like, if someone's good at the guitar and they play in a particular style, or they're good at the piano and they play at a particular style, what kind of roles and things are impacted by the skill of the people on your team?
I think it can impact style depending on the complexity of the music that you're playing. But I do think the leader has a strong impact on style as well, because even I can remember early on, even over at KCBT when I was leading, the few occasions that I got to lead, of course I love gospel. So it's like, even though it's just a simple 4-chord progression, we got to put a little stank on this, y'all. And so we, I got to figure out a way to do that. Right. And so it's going to be somehow we're going to make it soulful, just because that's what, that's kind of the feel I wanted.
Right.
So the skill sets can create boundaries. And I think sometimes those boundaries are actually very healthy, because you learn what it takes to lead worship. As much as I love gospel music, I don't need that.
Yeah. So how frustrating is it when you are a praise and worship leader and the people on your team can't execute the things that you want to do?
I can't say that that's the case in today's world. Early on, maybe over at KCBT, and there are always songs that challenge us. But I think the boundaries, when you look at what the definition of creativity is, right? You're able to, with limitations, right? That's where creativity thrives. Mm-hmm. And so it's, I don't know that I've ever been like, oh my goodness, these people I can't work. I think that it's probably been the opposite of like, we can't work with Eric. It's more like that. But so I don't see that as being something that's ever been like super frustrating, because it's like, okay, we got boundaries, but let's figure out what we can do with this. And it always comes out to be something that it's like, man, praise the Lord, this is for God's glory.
So then in terms of style, obviously you come from a gospel background,
yes,
right? And so Black soulful choir is the thing that speaks to you. But we go to a multicultural church, and there are people that like all different kinds of styles of music. And so, at what level do you try to meet the cultural appetite, or like even maybe it's an issue of heart language, like in terms of worship, like people feel and certain styles resonate with them more at a soul level, the way gospel does with you. What balance do you have to strike in?
I see style as being an outpouring, an outpouring of discipleship, because my advice to worship leaders that we're developing is to lead in the way that God's created you, right? Mm-hmm. And so I don't think you have to oppose the style that you are familiar with. I do think you have to recognize those limitations in terms of, again, singability of a song, mm-hmm, and then accessibility of the song. How accessible is it? How can people engage? And so I think you have to be sensitive to that. I have to be sensitive to that even with gospel music. Most of the gospel music I listen to, we never do, right?
Yeah. Is that because most of it's worldly, or?
I don't know if I would say most of it. Some of it could be described as worldly, but I don't consider it to be accessible.
Okay. Yeah.
Like I think for some people it would be, would maybe put up a wall, or it would be hard for people to engage in worship. And mm-hmm, I feel like I have a better sense of that, having been at the church, for so long. And so it's like, I don't see people being able to engage in this, but mm-hmm, I do think discipleship, the benefit of discipleship is that, as you're making making disciples, God uniquely gifts people. So I use Brian as an example because
Brian Bustos.
Brian Bustos.
Leaders.
It's interesting because over the years, I think Brian and I have learned to trust each other, right? We both have different ears for music. So the stuff that he picks is stuff that I like it after he has, sort of Bustos-fied it, right?
Massaged it in his own way.
Massaged it and he put his spin on it.
Yeah.
But it's a song that if I listened to it in its original version, I would have never picked it, right? But he'll listen to a song and he's passionate about it and he'll do it and I'll sort of fall in love with it. And I would hope vice versa. I've heard him do some of the songs that I've selected. But I want Brian to lead in the way that God has created him with a sensitivity to our people engaging in this, because that creates the boundary of style. Any style can alienate people. And so we got to make sure that people are engaged, and we can't get so far ahead that people aren't worshiping. And so that's the boundary that's important.
I'm thinking about how engaged a worship leader has to be. And you're talking about how they need to be very aware of how the congregation is responding. And it makes me think a lot about the devotional aspect of what you guys do when you lead worship. I know this is very common in terms of formula for a lot of evangelical or Bible-believing churches. They'll do some worship songs, and then someone who's leading will take a moment to give a devotion. And I wonder if there's like an art form to that in terms of presenting that devotional aspect to the congregation in a way that, again, follows the principles that you shared in the previous podcast.
So for me, the devotionals are an outpouring. It's an overflow of what God's already doing. So I'm not like creating like every Sunday morning, I got to create a devotional. No, like I keep a journal. I'm in the Word, in the mornings and at night, and I'm writing what God's showing me, and I'm responding to it, and I'll see things that where God moves me. And so with that little tidbit, I'll want to take just a couple moments and share that with the congregation, and then connect it with what we're singing. So it usually happens in that moment where I'm looking through my journal and I'm, man, this is what God's doing. And I just want to share that a little bit with people, because I do think that it's still an element of praise and worship, right? Because I'm audibly talking about what God's doing, and I'm sharing with them from Scripture, and they can see how it connects, and hopefully it encourages people, because you get a lot of people that come in and they're in different places in their life, different seasons, and they need encouragement.
Yeah. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that when you present the devotion, you present the personal thing that God's done in your life that He's shown you recently. You've got to get it. It's got to have a hook to draw people back into to praise. In other words, it has to direct their focus. Is there something that you need to, like when someone's putting something like that together, is that just something you just need experience with?
Yeah. So, and maybe because I needed experience with it, so I had to do it and get some feedback. But I think as long as you can explain what God showed you and why you should worship in response to it, right? And I think that's the key. And sometimes I think where error can happen is we never get back to the place of victory, right? So I've been struggling and I can share the struggle, but there needs to be a connection, I believe, to why we are victorious in Christ and why we can engage in worship, even if we are going through a tough season, why Christ still deserves our worship, and let's do that. I do think that it takes a lot of worship ministry is that whole practice. It happens in our rehearsals, and then on Sunday morning, you just got to give people a shot to go and do it, and then you kind of find your way in doing it.
What role does audiovisual play in terms of establishing a strong praise and worship team? I know that, like in our church, the structure is that the praise and worship team kind of is in some regard submitted to the worship team and driven by what's happening with the worship team, but on a whole nother plane, they're working the gizmos and the technology back there, and they've got things that they're responsible for that the worship team should never even be aware of. What does it look like to have a healthy relationship between a worship team and an AV team?
Whoever you have overseeing the AV piece needs to be in constant communication with whoever's leading worship. And I see it in much the same way when we talked about in the last episode of, my job as a worship leader is to be submitted to the vision of my pastor. It's very important that you have that dynamic even with the AV team, because the pastor and the worship director will have a vision in terms of what that should look like, and you want an AV team that's behind that vision and wanting to carry it out and minimize distractions. And so there's a need to always be training and growing in excellence. You know, there's a lot of problems that come up in with AV, with equipment, that you've got to have qualified people to be able to troubleshoot, right? And so that just requires constant training and investment, and then just a desire for excellence. The one thing that I'll give you, you know, and this is something that some churches will struggle with, is, and it seems silly, but it underscores the point, right? With even the PowerPoint slides and advancing the slides, and you know, it's like, okay, so whoever it is that's doing that, like, you're holding the hymnal for the whole church. Right. Yeah. And so, right, like, a lot of people don't know the words unless you advance that slide. Right. Yeah. And if you don't advance it, literally the whole church stops worshiping.
Sure.
So that's the critical nature of it.
So, okay. So here's the I've wanted to ask this for so long. It's been in my mind.
And it wasn't on the list that you sent me of questions you were going to ask.
No, I'm completely, I'm improvising.
Improvising. Yeah. Great. Yay.
Okay. So I wanted to ask this. When you're instructing the AV team, when should they advance the slide? Is it before the last syllable?
Before we sing the last word, because we already know, we're reading those words in advance. So before, I'm passionate about this. Okay. It may feel uncomfortable to advance it before people sing that last word, but we already know what when we're singing the last word, we're already looking for the next word.
Right.
And so before we sing the last word, I don't care if the last word has 4 syllables, right? Yeah. Like, before we sing that last word, we already know what it is, and we're looking for the next word. So
good. Thank you for
I can't give you book, chapter, verse on that, but
that's helpful
what
for me.
We need,
because I feel like I can't ever sing that next word if it doesn't advance in time. I get stuck. Yeah, the team is singing it, and now I'm behind. I'm out of the loop, and again, it's a distraction. So that's good. That's good insight. Okay, so speaking of that, then here's another question. What are some of the things that you've run into, throughout the years, that you've experienced in terms of the enemy's distraction? And this is probably an opportunity for you to maybe speak in terms of what you've run into, maybe some weird stories or some situations that you've had. Don't give names because we don't want to do that. But where you feel like the enemy has been at work, and anecdotally, maybe the audience can take something away from that. Has there been experiences that you've had that have just been like, wow, that's a great lesson in worship and in praise?
Yeah. So I think enemies of worship, the one thing that comes to mind is immaturity. And that's why that discipleship filter is so important, because when you have an immature believer in any ministry, it can be, distracting, but it can be particularly harmful, I think, in the worship ministry. And so I guess the best example, this is something that I heard from someone a long time ago, but if you think about how a baby responds to something, like when a baby's hungry or needs something, that baby has no regard for environment, right? That baby just starts crying and is a distraction everywhere until that baby gets what it wants, right? But as you grow in maturity, you learn that even though you may have a concern, you learn to acknowledge the environment that you're in, and to wait and to address it in a manner that demonstrates maturity on your part, right? You don't just get to make a scene. Right. And so, that would be something that have to keep a close eye on, or just watch out for, because that can be distracting, even in terms of a practice, right? And the practice is becoming,
which in some ways is probably just as important. Those practices,
they're critical. Yeah. So, but the mood of a practice, right? Where like, I feel like I should look forward to coming to practice, right? But if I'm dreading practice because there's irritation and agitation because of issues that need to be addressed in terms of personalities, then we need to sit down and talk about what that is and get those things out there and get that cleaned up, because that hinders worship.
Sure. And I would think that, like, especially when you're dealing with artists tend to have strong opinions about creativity. A practice could get derailed really fast if someone's opinion was too strong and they were verbalizing that and undermining things that were going on.
Absolutely. And, the thing about worship ministry that I think is important that we all need to remember with regard to music in general. Okay, so you step back from worship ministry and every other facet of your life. When you listen to music, it's the music you want to listen to, right?
Right.
And then when you don't want to hear it anymore, you turn it off. And worship ministry is this interesting point to where our natural inclinations are not something that we can do anymore, right? We don't just get to turn it off. On a Sunday morning, you come in and maybe the songs that are being sung are not songs that you would normally want to sing. And then you have to make a choice to die to self and engage in worship. And that same principle is true even in practice, that it's not what you want in your flesh, right?
Right.
But in this one time, we have to find unity.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to move forward. And I think a healthy worship ministry, if we're responding right, we're being challenged in that area. I'm challenged in that area because not every song that is picked is a song I would have picked or necessarily like. But man, so am I worshiping a style or am I worshiping the Lord? And if so, I need to engage in worship regardless of whether or not it's the style I want. And I will say that, the first half of my worship ministry experience was singing a lot of songs that I wouldn't have normally picked.
Right.
And even now, I do get obviously a lot of leniency in terms of the songs that I pick, but I'm not dictating to other leaders what songs they should pick unless there's a biblical issue there.
Right.
And if there's a clear melody, there's leniency. So we don't always sing the songs that I want to sing. I know some people think, oh, you're the leader, you get to sing all the songs. No, that's not true.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And it makes me also think about churches that have traditional services versus like contemporary services. And I know that philosophically we're kind of opposed to that perspective. Can you explain why we wouldn't ever? So
I feel the reason why I am sort of diametrically opposed to that is, so the time for us to worship is the one time where we all come together. And I don't want the style of worship that I'm playing to reinforce division within the church. Old people and young people ought to be able to come together and for 1 hour be able to unite in worship. So if we've got 2 services or 3 services, my personal philosophy, and I know other people differ on this, is I want there to be the same sound. And then you make a decision about what time you want to be here. But, worshiping with one voice, can we set aside our particular differences on music and just come together as one? And if I'm playing a progressive sound and a traditional sound, then what that tells me that translates to is all the older people go to one service and all the younger people go to another service, and we're not together worshiping. Right. And that's where I have an issue with it.
Yeah, there needs to be unity.
Absolutely.
And the more multicultural or diverse a church is, the more work it requires to blend those cultures together and make them work in harmony with one another. So that's good. In closing, I want to ask if you do us a favor.
Oh, okay.
Would you put together a playlist for us?
Yes.
So that we could publish with this podcast that is a nice blend of multicultural sounds that you might hear in a service here at Midtown Baptist Temple, songs that really resonate with you. So we can get a little bit of your personality, the gospel stuff, but then also maybe some of the other songs that we like to sing. Would
Absolutely.
you do that for us?
Absolutely.
Awesome.
I got the playlist, so I'll just get it over to you.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thanks, dude. Thank you, Eric, for hanging. It's always fun hanging out with you because we're good friends.
Thank you, brother.
But I'm glad to share you with everybody else in this episode talking about worship. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you as well for joining us for another episode of the Postscript. Again, you want to check out the playlist that we're gonna publish with this podcast. So you can listen to some of the stuff that Eric's been listening to or some of the things that we like to sing here at Midtown. If you've got questions about praise and worship ministry, I'm sure Eric would love to hear from you. If you're a worship leader and you've got questions, things that you've been struggling with, feel free to reach out to us and we can put you in contact with Eric. And I'm sure he'd enjoy speaking with you and talking to you about that. If you've enjoyed the podcast and you don't yet subscribe, please follow us on any of the major podcast platforms, whether it be Apple or Android. If you are a YouTube person and you like watching video, you can subscribe at YouTube as well. Thank you again for joining us. We appreciate your time and we hope to see you next week.
My name is Brian Bustos, and I am a Living Faith Bible Institute student. And I'm also a husband, and I'm also a father. In this stage in my life, things are definitely chaotic. I've been called by God to serve in my local church here in Kansas City, and in any given week, that may look like leading worship, or preparing for a Bible study, or even teaching a class. And this is where Living Faith Bible Institute is so important to my life. First, it gives me focus, but two, it's flexible. And so if I can't make that Saturday morning class, I can still catch it online, whether it's remotely or even sometime later in the week, like during my lunch break. In essence, I don't have to put my life on pause. Enroll for classes at lfbi.org. If you are interested in donating to LFBI to support future pastors and leaders, please visit lfbi.org/donate.